Let's look at estimating mixed costs using the high-low method. Now, as a refresher, mixed costs are costs that have both a fixed and variable component. And managers often need to separate mixed costs into those two components to help with their decision making. Common mixed costs you'll see are phone bills, maintenance costs, utilities, some of your overhead. And the issue is that sometimes it's not easy to directly identify that fixed versus variable component, and so we need to use the high-low method to help us do that. So the high-low method is a form of regression analysis, and that is helping us to identify the relationship between the cost and the changes in the activity level and finding that fixed and variable component of the cost. So let's look at the steps to the high-low method. Our first step is determining the cost and activity data. Once we've found that data, we can determine the variable cost per unit. After that, we can find the fixed cost that's related to that overall mixed cost. Once we have that information, we can use it to create an equation for our mixed cost, which will ultimately help estimate future costs. So let's start with step 1, determining the cost and activity data. Now, if you're at a business, you're going to have to collect that data. You're going to have to look at past invoices and expenses, look at past activity levels, and use that to do your analysis. Now, in the textbook, that information is usually given to you. So here's an example of some cost and activity data. Our activity here is the number of units produced, and our cost is the overhead cost. Now we'll notice as our units changes, our cost changes, but it's not changing directly and proportionally, so we know it's a mixed cost. Okay, our month is not relevant to our analysis. That's just the months they collected the data. Okay, a month is not an activity. Just because we have a month, that did not determine the overhead cost. What impacted our cost was how many units we produced. Now that we have our data, we can determine the variable cost per unit. Now this part's a little tricky, and this is where the high-low of the high-low method comes in. First, we're going to find our high level of activity, then our low. We're going to use those to find the change, and then we're going to divide to determine our variable cost per unit. So let's look at those steps. Here's our data. First, we're going to find our highest level of activity. Remember, we're looking at activity, not month, not first and last month, but our high level of activity. And so we can see here that our high is month 5. Next, we're going to find our low level of activity. Again, we look at our units produced because that's what's determining the cost. And we can see that our low month was month 2. Now that we've determined our highest and our lowest level of activity, we can take those and find the change. So all we need to do is subtract, and we can see here that between our low month and our high month, our cost changed by $420, and our units produced changed by 190. Now that we have our change, we can move to our last step here, which is to divide to find the variable cost per unit. So I'm going to take the change in cost and divide it by the change in activity to determine my variable cost per unit. We have now determined that our estimated variable cost per unit is $2.21, meaning for every 1 unit produced, the variable costs are $2.21. Now remember, we're not done. A mixed cost includes a variable and a fixed component. We've just identified the variable cost. Now we need to determine the fixed cost. So how do we find the fixed cost? Well, remember, our total cost for our overhead, our mixed cost, consists of a variable and fixed component. We can rearrange that formula to say, well, if we take the total minus the variable, that can help us find the fixed. So we're going to take this formula and look at our data. Now remember, our total cost depends on the activity level, and our variable cost also depends on the activity level, our total variable cost. So again, we're going to look at our high and our low month, and we're going to select either our high month or our low month. So I selected the high month, which was month 5, where we produced 395 units, and our total cost was $2,490. We can take that and plug it into our formula. Next, we need to determine our total variable cost. Remember, our total variable cost is dependent on how many units we produce. So if our variable cost per unit was $2.21, which is what we determined back in step 2, we can multiply that by the 395 units that we produced to determine that when we produced 395 units, our total variable cost was $873, excuse me. We can take that number and plug it into our formula. So now we have taken our total overhead cost, subtracting our variable cost at that level of activity, and determined our fixed cost is $1,617. Now remember, when we did this, we selected either the high or the low level of activity. It doesn't matter which one you choose. You can do the high or the low, not any other. It has to be the high point or the low point. So we can repeat step 3 just as a double check using our low level of activity. Okay? So our low level was month 2. We can take that, plug it into our formula, determine our variable cost at that level of activity by multiplying the 205 units times my 221 and plug that into our formula. We subtract, look at that, we got the same thing. Okay, so again, for step 3, you can choose either the high or the low point for your data. Okay, you should get the same answer no matter which one you choose. And so it's a good double check to do both. Okay. Now that we have identified our variable and our fixed components, we can create an equation for our cost. So again, remember, our total cost is that fixed plus variable component. So we can take that and say, well, our fixed cost we determined in step 3 was $1,617, and our variable cost was $221 per unit that we produced, or I put an X for my per unit. Now maybe this looks a little bit familiar. You're thinking, this might look familiar. Yes, this is basically an equation for a line, right? My total cost, Y equals MX plus B. They're just a little bit flipped here, right? My total cost, I can determine by taking my fixed cost plus my 221 per unit. Which means now that I have this equation for the cost, we can use this to estimate future costs, or step 5. So I can say, well, if this is my cost formula, what if we produce 325 units one month? What could we expect our overhead costs to be? Well, we can take that, plug it into our formula, and determine that our expected cost would be $2,335. Okay, so again, we took that high-low method and used it to determine our fixed and variable component, which now we can use to estimate costs in the future.